Well, we're here today for our 2024 West Coast Pastors Conference here at Diamond Bar, and I have in the podcast studio with me today Jack Abeelen from Morningstar Christian Fellowship in Whittier, California.
That's it.
And Jack, I mean, you are a voice that everybody recognizes, primarily from your radio program, and obviously you've been doing radio from a very long time, and many people know your voice just today alone. When I mentioned to people that we're going to interview Jack, I mean, so many different people are like, hey, like, here's something I remember for him, or his voice is unmistakable. And that was the first thing I got from you when I met you earlier. So, but welcome, welcome
you.
here to Diamond Bar, and we're glad to have you here. But I think one of the most amazing things is speaking with guys like yourself that have a lot of years of history and in terms of ministry. You have a lot of experience with history. I got some questions for you that we'll jump into. But before we do all of that, I really just want to introduce the audience to Jack Abeelen and your ministry. And I know it started many years ago, and obviously you were raised as a Catholic all the way to you were about 18 years old. And then you got saved listening to the a Bible study, right? At a home Bible study or something like that?
My good friends. I'd actually gone over to his house to buy some drugs.
Oh,
And
nice.
he had gotten saved during the weekend and invited me in. And by the end of the evenings, I gave my life to Christ.
So how many years was it from the time that you gave your life to Christ to the time that you entered into formal ministry?
Full time.
Yes.
I got saved in 1973, and I started full-time ministry in 1980.
1980. And that
But
was
before that, I was teaching in a church already at Calvary Chapel Downey, actually,
nice.
for quite a few years, and taught a home study as well.
Oh,
So
nice.
probably 3 or 4 years after I got saved, I was doing something.
Nice.
But God opened a door for me in 1980.
So obviously that was, Pastor Jeff, and what an amazing man to sit under. And then from all that, you started the church in Whittier, 85, right?
Yeah, we actually went out in September of 84 in a home Bible study on Tuesday nights, and 100 people showed up. And we said, well, we'll try it on Thursday as well. And another 100 folks showed up then. And so we combined those two and said, well, maybe this is what the Lord wants to do. So we started in April 21st of 1985, our first formal service as Morningstar Christian Chapel,
Very cool. So with all those years of ministry experience, there's so many different people that are listening to this podcast that for some guys that are just barely getting started in ministry, Jack, maybe some that are considering that call of God upon their lives, to start a church plant and to fulfill the call that God put upon their lives. But with that in mind, I mean, so what is the heart of a pastor, of a shepherd, and what should that look like now that you have all these years of experience? Looking back, what would you say to a younger Jack, where you're saying, here's what you should know, or here's what should be going on in your life? What is that heart of a pastor?
It'd be nice if I could do that, wouldn't it? I think one of the things I learned maybe more than anything else over the years was that you have to be faithful to the Lord. I always tell our young guys in the church, you can't teach calling. Once somebody knows they're called, you can help them along, but you can't teach calling. So when someone comes and says, I feel called, and over time that calling doesn't go away, then I think that you could at least begin to say to yourself, this is something God wants me to do. So then what do I do? And then I begin to learn how can I communicate God's word a little bit clearer? How can I be available to folks and yet not wipe myself out in so many responsibility in the church. But for me, the calling was always there. When my wife and I met, I said to her, I'm going to be a pastor one day. And she said, okay, I can get along with that. And we headed in that direction. Morningstar, when it started, obviously, financially, it was very difficult. I came from a very large church. We had a house. We had a mortgage. We had kids in Christian school. What you do. And we went out basically on our own. I ended up working for the church for the first 4 years at $200 a week. And that was a lot. And my wife took a full-time job in the supermarket so that we could make ends meet. And there were times we had $28 left at the end of the month, $15 left. And God taught us about being faithful. So there's a lot of lessons that you can learn when you step out that are hard to teach from a book. Or even to teach from a Bible class, right? So I learned those as I went forward, and I didn't always learn them quickly. I mean, God provides. God's been faithful. But I think if I had to say something to me when I started, it was that God can do what you can't. You be faithful. And God has to do all the things that you think you maybe have to do and you can't. One of the things I learned when we started the church, And a lot of people came to wish us well, but they didn't stick around. The
Mm.
church was a lot smaller than the well wishers. And I had a friend in Long Beach at the time, was a pastor, and I went to him and I said, "People aren't staying; they come, but they leave." And he said, "Well, if you're willing to give it your all for one, God can use you. If you're not willing to do that for just the one or the two that come,
Mm.
God can't use you." And that changed the way I looked at things. And literally, it was 6 months later that we had 400 people, 500 people coming. So God had a way of having to drive those things home.
Mm.
But again, to the folks that want to be in ministry, if you have a desire, James said that that to desire to be a bishop, that's quite a calling. You can't teach that. That has to come from God's Spirit. And it may come and go to some folks, and then maybe that's not a calling. But if you can't get rid of it, no matter how much you try sometimes, I think you got to stick with it. And then let's see what God will do next.
Yeah, you make a good point, because that calling of God is not something that's fabricated. It's not
No.
something that you just think, I'm just going to adopt this mindset. I'm going to adopt this idea that it's a career or it's some sort of a
There's
vocation.
no philosophy there. It's just it's a work of God's Spirit in the heart.
And I think that's one of the greatest things I love about Calvary Chapel, especially just hearing, Chuck for all these years and all
Yeah.
the different C2000, 3000s, and all the other thousands that I can't even keep up with.
Sure.
It's just that bleeding heart for just fulfilling that call of God. And for some, it is to shepherd a church, and for some, it's to be, that assistant pastor or that faithful, elder within the church that will come alongside a new church plant or not, or established church, and to get involved in leadership and to be able to see that calling of God modeled before young men
Yeah.
today, where they can see, whether it's a guy that's been in ministry for many, many years or somebody who hasn't, for them to say that fire's still there. Like, I still see it within him. I see it in his teaching. I hear it in his teaching. I see it in the way that he addresses the people as a shepherd.
Yeah.
And that's contagious. For us here at Golden Springs, we see that modeled all the time with Pastor Rawl constantly, and he's never lost that fire. So for us, it's something that's easy to see and attain, but at the same time, you can't fabricate it. It's
I
not
don't think
something
you
that,
can.
no, you can't. Well, I think people have tried, but they'll fail and they'll be miserable because that isn't what God has.
And it's
for
the way that people build churches. They'll try to put a lot of pressure upon people. Hey, you got to show up. You want to be used, come. But if you have to say all that to someone, maybe they're not the ones that you want around. So it's fun to watch and see the Lord's hand upon people's lives.
Yeah. So what has
And
been your approach all these years with discipleship? Because obviously you have a church that's very thriving.
Yeah.
Obviously you got a huge congregation, and there's so many different discipleship opportunities. But how has that worked for you? And what have you done all these years to disciple other men?
I think when we were smaller, it was in terms of personal. I took guys under my wing and kind of went with them, and that was easy enough. When the church gets larger, you can't do that as well. You can certainly do that some. We had a Bible college for 6 years at a time when we had a lot of young people wanting to go through that formal training. We found after 6 years that there was less of them wanting to do that, so we changed. But all of our pastors now have somebody with them that they're training, elders that are being raised up. Chuck used to say you can always tell the elders they're eldering, so those guys that you can see the Lord's hand upon. So I think it becomes a personal kind of voyage with individual pastors who see folks around them. And I think at least for my stay at Downey, let's say, I didn't start off wanting to go out and start a church. I was hired to be an assistant to Pastor Jeff. I started off teaching a Bible study on Tuesday nights. It was small. I ended up taking Sunday nights over, which was large. We did movies for years on Friday night, called them New Creature Features. I was happy doing those things. But at some point, your heart began to be stirred. And it was funny, as a young guy, I used to watch Jeff, and, I had the opportunity to go out into his office, shut the door, and say, hey, I don't agree with this, or, I don't understand this. And he was gracious enough to put up with most of that stuff. But I vowed, hey, when I get out to start my own church, if that ever happens, I'm going to change these things. I must tell you, 90% of the things that I was going to change, I left exactly the same. But my calling changed, or at least the desire changed.
Sure.
It's hard to have a church with a fella that's going to be going to the pulpit. Those folks usually leave. At some point, they go forward, and that's what you want anyway. So I won't say that I was called to be a senior pastor. I just knew I was called to be a pastor.
Mm.
And over time, those things grew. In the 5 or 6 years I was at Downey full time, I was ready to go, and things worked out well. I mean, they weren't easy. It's hard to have you and nobody else, to be there just to doing everything. We had some wonderful folks early on that helped us start that over the next couple of years kind of drifted away, but it's an amazing work that God does. I'd like to quantify it for you and tell you, it's 12 pages if you'll do these things. I just think if you start with calling and what that God's desire for me as a pastor is to share his word and get people grounded in it.
Awesome.
I'm pretty happy with that. Whether they stay or not, whether they go, whether they're going to be on staff or go out to start another church, I'm a happy guy. I want to see them do well.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So let's get a little personal, Jack.
Okay.
One of the things I like to ask other pastors is, what does the daily devotional life look like to you? Because so many different people have so many different styles and ways of how they go about their daily devotional life, but we always want to encourage others as well as to being faithful, in their devotional time with the Lord. But what does that look like for you? And did it change over the years? And is it the same now as it was when you first started as a pastor? What does that look like, and what are the lessons learned?
Definitely has changed over the years. Again, going back to starting up, I was so busy doing literally everything that my devotional lives consisted oftentimes of driving home in prayer or getting up in the morning while we're setting up chairs going, Lord, you got to be with us.
Oh, wow, yeah.
As the church grew and as I got more help, and I'll take you to today, we have a large staff. I literally can come in and spend as much time as I need in the office. No one will bother me. But that's only been the last few years. So now I find myself even in devotions as far as studying, having much more time and to reflect, to think about things. It seems like you're on a treadmill when you first start. You're running and you're trying to keep up. And not that you ignore the Lord. Certainly you do not, because you're solely dependent upon His work. But I think when things slow down a little bit, when you get some help, it's a little easier for me now than it was then. But my devotional life is usually tied into my teachings. I study for me first. If it doesn't help me, I don't want to teach anybody else about it, no matter how good it sounds. Mm-hmm. So I try to pass along things I learn personally, I guess, and maybe teach in a way that I learn. So that tends to be real helpful. And it's served me well. I'm happy with the way that I can now spend time with the Lord and spend time in His Word and prepare for the things I have to do, still teaching a lot. So
I've always been encouraged by even hearing from Chuck years ago about how he would read all these old dead guy books.
I do that too.
And Pastor Rawls got quite a few of the old dead guy books, and we've always had that around us, and we've always been encouraged to read the old dead guys and to be devotionally, of course, in the Word every single day.
Yeah.
And I think we just get concerned, when we hear of other people trying to shortcut what that looks like, and they seem to think that it's not as important. I can't think that somebody would embrace that model going into ministry and thinking that I'm going to make that secondary to everything that I do.
Yeah.
When it really just becomes, it really should be the primary, action that I take every single day is
Absolutely.
to be in the Word, and how is God speaking to me, and how am I going to give out if I'm not even taking in and allowing the Lord to mold and shape my mind and my heart for ministry so that I could help others. But that's just the thing for us, is we just want to encourage people to be in the Word and to not neglect, going through the Bible. Because you said first, I'm doing it for myself first, so that God could speak to me, and I've heard just different things over the years where it just seems like it's something that they take a shortcut on a daily basis.
It's terrible. I have 11,000 studies through the Bible that I can show you in my office, the hand printed and now typed up. But every time I teach, that's a great place to start, but no place to finish. And unfortunately, today, some of these young churches, they're results-oriented, so they can fill the pews and get a lot of people showing up. They think they've done something well. But real ministry is not like painting a room. You get done painting a room at the end of the day, you go, man, this is beautiful. Look what I did. Mm-hmm. Real ministry is, I'll look at the room 10 years from now and see how things are going. Wow. It's very difficult because fruit takes time, right? But if whatever you're planting, you're going to reap. So we're committed to teaching. I feel like God's called me to teach. I'd like to tell you I'm an evangelist. I don't think I am. People get saved, but I'm no Greg Laurie. I'm no Raul Reese. I mean, he's very good at that kind of ministry. Um, but I really feel like that's what God's called me to do. We've written a lot of books. We've done a lot of things to help people learn the scriptures, and I'm most comfortable there. So you're right. I'm reading hundreds of pages a week, sometimes getting 2 lines out of it. Sometimes really being excited. And it's funny, read the dead guys. They are the best guys to read still to this day, I think.
How do we encourage the church, to vote righteously and to go about it in such a way where we can still remain biblical and,
Yeah.
and yet true, but at the same time, we want to see change in our country, and
Yeah.
and maybe that's not the answer per se, is the man who's sitting in the White House. I mean, we know it's a matter of the heart. We know it's man's heart.
Yeah.
But our culture is going nuts. Everything just seems like it's upside down. But what are some of your thoughts with that?
We definitely need a revival. My personal opinion about church and politics, we encourage our people to get involved. I really don't think you're going to find too many believers who need to be taught what the important topics are. I can't imagine.
Yeah.
We need somebody to tell us how to vote, because I suspect you bring 10 Christians in here and you talk to them about abortion or gay marriage, or they're going to take the right side in those things because they're reading their Bibles. So we do encourage our folks to get involved. I think there's a personal responsibility and a freedom, and boy, I'd be foolish to ignore that. I don't get in the pulpit pushing one side or the other. I just teach the Word of God. I figure that's the best way they can be prepared. But we definitely encourage their local involvement. I mean, we have a mayor in our city who's a Christian. When he got reelected this year, I had him come to church so we could all lay hands on and pray for him.
Nice.
There's a couple of other city council folks that we keep in contact with, that we're glad that they're out there representing God and His Word. A couple of officers in the local police department that we stay close to, from a corporate standpoint, from a church standpoint. But as far as personal responsibility, I think it falls on the individual to prayerfully get involved. Not voting's foolish, not taking your opportunity is certainly a foolish thing to do. Most people like to write off their giving on taxes because they have a rule that supports them. All of a sudden, they're all political. So, but I tend to stay away from politics in the pulpit. I just don't. There's no salvation there. Whoever wins is going to let you down.
I was listening to a study recently, and Pastor Chuck was he said that somebody had advised him to stop talking about politics from the pulpit. He said, okay, I hear you, and I won't. And he starts teaching, and then he starts going off about a judge and all this other stuff. He goes, there I go again. He said, there I go again. He goes, all right, I'll just stick to teaching.
I know, that was his
cracking
conviction.
Up when I heard that.
Yeah, he was very great. I like Chuck so much. He was the reason I'm on the radio. Certainly, he's the reason I've done so well. We spent years with him. In fact, the last couple of sermons he did at our church. When he was really ill, he had already given his church to another, or at least the pulpit, and he wanted to teach, but he didn't want to step back in, so he'd call me on Wednesday. He goes, what are you teaching? And whatever it was, I would tell him. He says, I'd like to come teach tonight. I said, Chuck, you're always welcome, but he's too ill to climb up on the pulpit, so we'd bring it down to the ground, and he would come, and it was great, just sharing. But that last 6 months of his life, at dinner a couple of times, sit at the church, people just loved him. And he said, well, keep everyone in their seats. I got to get to the car. He really wasn't strong enough to visit with folks. So I learned a lot from Chuck. I don't think we ever talked politics together as to how that affects ministry. But that's my personal conviction that we've been practicing for the last many, many years. I just won't do it.
Praise God.
Yeah.
Well, Jack, we appreciate you stopping by today and spending a little bit of time with us. And I'm sure many are encouraged by just your testimony of your church and just everything that we talked about. So thanks for coming by. We appreciate it.
Thank you, man. God bless you guys.
All right, God bless you, Jack.
Okay.